The divorce papers hit the white tablecloth with a crack that rang louder than the blizzard clawing at the windows of the Obsidian Lodge. My husband, Adam, didn't bother to meet my eyes. He studied his reflection in the curve of a soup spoon, slicking back his hair with that polished tech bro detachment he wore like plated steel. Across from us, his parents, Richard and Susan, sipped their aged Pinot Noir as though dismantling my life was simply another tasting course in their five-star evening. "Sign it, Rachel," Adam said, bored. "We both know you don't belong here." "Your outdated hardware." Richard rotated his glass slowly, his gaze locked on my hands marked with pale scars from welding sparks and flux burns. "Yes," he sneered. "Those grimy hands clash with the aesthetic of the founder's dinner. Sign the papers, take the payout, and vanish. Otherwise, we blacklist you. By morning, you won't exist in our circles." I didn't look at the divorce papers. I looked at the check the waiter had just laid between us. $18,400, vintage bottles I hadn't tasted. Truffle-laced dishes I hadn't ordered, a private dining surcharge for the honor of being publicly dismantled. Adam barked a laugh that made the crystal tremble. "What's wrong, Rachel? Can't handle it." "I'd cover the bill, but since we've been separated for 5 minutes, it feels like your expense. Maybe you can weld something in the back to work it off." Susan hid a smile behind her napkin. "Oh, Adam, that's wicked," she said lightly. "She can't help being destitute. It isn't her fault she doesn't fit somewhere like the Obsidian Lodge." I didn't cry, I didn't plead, I didn't even blink. Instead, a precise, glacial calm settled over me, the same narrowing of focus I feel when I lower my welding mask and strike a flame. The world contracted to a single point of heat. I slipped my hand into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas work jacket, its fabric stained with soot and engine grease, an insult to the Italian silk and tailored wool surrounding me. Adam watched with a smirk, expecting wrinkled bills or a declined debit card. What I withdrew was not plastic. It was a slab, a dense rectangle of raw volcanic glass edged in solid platinum. The surface was matte and drank in the light instead of reflecting it. It was cold, heavier than it looked. When I placed it on the silver tray, it didn't click. It landed with a muted final thud. It sounded like a gavel closing a case. "Run it," I said. The waiter, young, kind-eyed, who had been glancing at me with sympathy all night, reached for the tray. His fingers brushed the card and he froze. His gaze traced the black glass, the platinum edge. His expression shifted from confusion to something close to fear. His hands began to shake. "Sir," Adam snapped, "just charge it." I can't process this here," the waiter whispered. He wasn't looking at Adam. He was staring at me as if I'd just detonated something invisible. He tapped his earpiece. "Code black, table 1, code black." Richard slammed his palm down. "What is this nonsense? Stop playing games. My son is divorcing this woman and we are leaving." "Get the manager. You won't need to call him," I said evenly. "He's already here." The kitchen doors swung open. "Mr. Renshaw, the general manager of the Obsidian Lodge, a man who ran the mountain like a fortified state, walked into the private room flanked by 2 security officers. Richard straightened, preparing to invoke his influence. "Renshaw, finally, this woman is attempting to use a fraudulent payment method. I want her escorted out." Renshaw didn't so much as glance at him. He walked past Adam, past Susan. He stopped directly before my chair. He clasped his hands behind his back and bowed. Not a polite inclination, a full formal bow. "Miss Kincaid," he said, his voice sharp enough to cleave the air, "we were not expecting you this season." The owner's protocol has been activated. The room didn't merely fall silent, it crystallized. Adam blinked. "Miss what?" "Her name is Rachel." "And what do you mean, owner?" Renshaw turned toward him slowly, his expression edged with contempt. "That card," he said, "is the Onyx Key. It belongs to the sole proprietor of the Obsidian Lodge and the entire mountain range beneath it. You are dining as a guest of Miss Rachel Kincaid." I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest, and studied my husband and his parents as their faces drained of color. "You were going to blacklist me from society, Richard?" I asked quietly. "You can't blacklist the landlord." I glanced at the trembling waiter. "Run it. To understand why the air had thinned in that room, you have to understand the hands that held that card. My hands are not delicate. They are not manicured like Susan's or smooth like the investor's Adam Quartz. They are rough. The pads of my fingers are thick with calluses. My knuckles are mapped with silver scars from molten slag and slipping grinders. For 7 years, I've been a metal sculptor. I take raw industrial girders, objects dismissed as scrap, and bend them with fire into something that holds both violence and grace. Adam despised my work. To him, it was grime, labor. Something to be concealed when his venture capital circle came over for cocktails. But steel has a virtue men like Adam do not. It does not pretend. A weak weld fails cleanly. It doesn't smile while calculating collapse. Men like Adam are vapor. They survive on projections, pitch decks, valuations that flicker across screens like mirages. As he stared at the onyx key, bewildered, I traced the long road that had led us here. Cruelty rarely arrives armed and obvious. It seeps in through hairline fractures. It's incremental. A joke about my boots being too heavy for his office gala. A suggestion to scrub the grease from beneath my nails before meeting his colleagues. A gentle request that I stop discussing my art because it bored the shareholders. I adjusted, I recalibrated. I made myself smaller, quieter, more polished, as though I were machinery that required fine-tuning. I thought if I reduced the parts of me that embarrassed him, he would look at me the way he once had. I didn't realize I was simmering in his contempt. I confused control for mentorship. I mistook belittlement for guidance. I was so committed to stabilizing the structure that I ignored the rot in its foundation. There was one truth, however, I never offered him. Years before Adam, my Aunt Catherine placed a velvet box in my hands. She was no gentle matriarch. She was an industrial magnate who operated out of a converted aircraft hangar and commanded a global hospitality empire with ruthless precision. She taught me that dignity is the only asset that cannot be liquidated. On my 25th birthday, she pressed the card into my palm. She told me it wasn't for indulgence. Not for sports cars or couture handbags. It was leverage, a breaker bar for when the bolts rusted shut and the pressure threatened to split me. Wealth, she said, is the power to say no. I kept the card buried in my safe beneath invoices and design sketches. I lived on what I earned. I paid half the mortgage, covered groceries. When Adam's third startup collapsed and he couldn't meet payroll, I quietly moved $12,000 into our joint account so he wouldn't lose face. I let him believe he was the provider. I thought that was love. Now he looked at me as if I were obsolete hardware he could discard. He believed he was shedding a broken wife. He didn't realize he was attempting to evict the owner. He never understood that Kincaid wasn't merely a middle name I rarely used. It was the name etched into the deed of the mountain beneath his feet. He had looked at me for 5 years. He had never truly seen me, and under the cold light of that private dining room, I understood something with perfect clarity. The restoration period was over. It was time to strike the torch. For a moment after the revelation, I expected apology. I thought they would scramble to salvage dignity, to claim misunderstanding. But people like the Hargroves do not bend when exposed. They calcify. This is entrapment, Susan spat, her face mottled with fury. You deceived us. You let us believe you were struggling while you were sitting on a fortune. That is manipulation, Rachel. That is cruel. I looked at her, honestly puzzled. I deceived you, I asked softly. I wore the same boots for 3 years because Adam insisted we conserve cash for his seed rounds. I never pretended to be poor, Susan. I simply didn't tell you about the safety net because Aunt Catherine made me promise never to use it unless I was in danger, and tonight you proved I was. Adam stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He didn't look remorseful, he looked furious. It was a physical intimidation tactic he'd used before crowding my space to make me feel small. You can't kick us out, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. We're partners, remember. California is a community property state. Anything you have, I have. That hotel, this lodge, that card, it's marital property. You just handed me the keys to the kingdom. Rachel, thank you. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then I looked up at his eyes. For years, I had flinched when he got like this. I had softened my voice and tried to de-escalate. But tonight, I felt nothing but cold contempt. Take your hand off me, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the density of lead. He didn't let go, or what you'll call the manager. I'm the husband of the owner, I outrank him. Mr. Renshaw, I said, not breaking eye contact with Adam. Yes, Miss Kincaid. Renshaw stepped forward, 2 security guards mirroring his movement. Mr. Hargrove seems to be confused about the nature of our ownership structure. Please escort him back to his seat. If he touches me again, have him arrested for assault. The guards didn't hesitate. One of them stepped between us, breaking Adam's grip with a swift, practiced motion. Adam stumbled back, looking at the guard, then at me, shock replacing the anger. He wasn't used to people saying no to him. Richard, sensing the shift in power, tried a different tactic. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, trying to summon the authority of the boardroom. Now hold on, let's not be hasty, Rachel. Clearly you're emotional, you're not thinking straight, you're a welder for God's sake. You don't know how to run a hospitality empire. If you try to manage this alone, you'll run it into the ground in a month. You need us, you need Adam's guidance. If you apologize for this outburst and reinstate Adam's position, we can discuss a consultancy arrangement. Otherwise, I will petition the court to have you declared mentally incompetent to manage the trust. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Mentally incompetent because I fix things with my hands instead of breaking them with spreadsheets. You think I'm weak because I'm quiet, but you forget something, Richard. I build structures that hold up skyscrapers. You build debt. I turn to Renshaw. I'm leaving. I have a suite waiting for me at the Summit property, and us. Susan asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and entitlement. Are you kicking us out into the blizzard? We'll freeze. I looked at them one last time. The wine was still breathing on the table. The fire was still warm. They were surrounded by luxury they hadn't earned and couldn't afford. No, I said, I'm not kicking you out. Keep pouring the wine, Renshaw. Let them order whatever they want. Let them stay as long as they like. Adam looked hopeful. Yes, I said, walking toward the door. I want you to sit in this beautiful room, drinking my wine, eating my food, and knowing that you are only here because I allow it. I want you to sit in the expensive seats you can't afford and think about the fact that the woman you called trash owns the roof over your head. It's a far worse punishment than the cold. I walked out of the dining room and into the lobby. The heavy timber doors closed behind me, sealing them in their golden cage. I didn't look back. I went to the Kincaid Trust offices in Denver the next morning. The building was glass and steel, sharp angles cutting into the blue winter sky. The kind of structure I used to admire for its engineering while feeling out of place in its lobby. Today, I walked in like I owned it because I did. My lawyer, Sarah, was waiting for me. She wasn't the type to offer tea and sympathy. She offered espresso and subpoenas. She had a team of forensic accountants who had been working since 4:00 a.m. pulling every financial thread attached to the name Harrove. You were smart to demand that transparency clause in the prenup, Sarah said, projecting a spreadsheet onto the conference room wall. It's going to be the autopsy of their lifestyle. Take a look. I stared at the screen. I expected to see wealth. I expected to see investment portfolios, real estate holdings, diversified assets. What I saw was red ink, rivers of it. Richard is leveraged to the hilt, Sarah explained, tapping a column. The country club membership's 3 months overdue. The vacation home in Aspen, second mortgage, high interest. Susan's jewelry is mostly leased or insured for triple its value against loans. They've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for a decade. And Adam, I asked, though I think I already knew. Adam is worse, Sarah said bluntly. He's not just broke, he's underwater. He put everything into crypto exchanges that collapsed 6 months ago. He's been covering his losses with high-risk bridge loans. I sat back in the leather chair, the smell of expensive coffee filling the room. It suddenly made sense. The cruelty, the constant need to belittle me, the obsession with my dirty job. They didn't hate me because I was poor. They hated me because my poverty was honest and their wealth was a lie. It's status anxiety, Sarah said, reading my expression. They needed you to be small so they could feel big. A person drowning will climb on top of anyone to get a breath of air. You were their flotation device, Rachel. You made them feel superior because you didn't play their game. Now that they know you own the stadium, the game is over. It's not just a game, I said, looking at the numbers. It's a Ponzi scheme. Exactly, Sarah said, but that's not the worst part. We found something else. A file hidden in a shell company Adam set up 2 months ago. You need to see this. She clicked a folder labeled Project Heist. Heistus, I murmured. He thought he was being clever, Sarah said grimly. Look at the collateral. The document on the screen was a loan application. A big one. $4.8 million from a private equity firm known for predatory lending and listed under secured assets. Wasn't a house or a car, it was my portfolio. He listed your intellectual property, Sarah said, her voice tight, your sculptures, your designs, your brand trademark. He claimed he had power of attorney over your artistic output. He effectively sold your future work to cover his past mistakes. I felt the blood drain from my face. My art wasn't just a job. It was my soul. It was the hours I spent sweating in the dark, the burns on my arms, the ache in my back. He had taken the one thing that was purely mine and used it to gamble on his own ego. He can't do that, I whispered. He doesn't own my work. He does if you sign this, Sarah said, pulling up a digital signature page. I looked at the signature. It was a perfect replica of my own. Too perfect, it was a digital stamp copied and pasted. I didn't sign that, I said, my voice turning to ice. I know, Sarah said. The timestamp on this document puts you at a gallery opening in Seattle. You were 3 states away. She looked at me, her eyes hard. This isn't just a divorce anymore, Rachel. This is forgery. This is grand larceny. This is a felony. I looked at the screen at the man I had once loved, reduced to a criminal file. He hadn't just tried to leave me with nothing. He had tried to steal who I was to save himself. Get the papers ready, I said. I'm not just countering the divorce, I'm pressing charges. Sarah pulled up the loan documents again, highlighting a section buried deep in the fine print. This isn't just about debt, she said, her voice dropping an octave. Look at the default terms. If he misses a payment, which he already has, the lender seizes the collateral immediately. They don't foreclose, they extract. I leaned in. The lender wasn't a bank. It was a private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings. The name sounded sterile, but the terms were predatory. They had the right to auction my intellectual property rights within 48 hours of default. He didn't just borrow money. I realized the horror setting in. He set me up to be erased. He knew he couldn't pay this back. He was counting on the divorce settlement to cover it, or he was just going to let them take my life's work and walk away. It's worse. Sarah said the loan was taken out to cover a margin call on his crypto losses. He burned your art to pay for his gambling addiction. And because he forged your signature as a Kogar, he made you liable for the entire $4.08, $8 million if the collateral doesn't cover it. I stood up and walked to the window. The city below looked small, manageable, but inside I felt like the walls were closing in. My sculptures weren't just metal, they were my voice. They were the only thing in my life that Adam hadn't touched, hadn't criticized, hadn't tried to mold into something corporate and shiny, and now he had turned them into a bargaining chip. He stole my future, I said, my voice trembling with a rage so pure it felt like heat. He tried to sell my name. And that, Sarah said, closing the laptop with a snap, is why we aren't negotiating alimony. We are going for the jugular. This forgery changes everything. It pierces the corporate veil. It voids any claim he has to marital assets because he entered the marriage with fraudulent intent or committed fraud during the union. We can freeze his accounts today. We can seize his passport. Do it, I said, freeze everything. I want him to feel what it's like to be helpless. I want him to know what it's like to have no options. Sarah picked up her phone. I'll call the district attorney. We're filing criminal charges for forgery and grand larceny. By the time he walks into that mediation room, he won't be a husband looking for a settlement. He'll be a defendant looking at 5 to 10 years. I looked at my hands, the scars, the calluses. They were the proof of my labor, my honesty. Adam had tried to use them against me to shame me and then to steal from me. But he had forgotten one thing about metal. You can heat it, you can beat it, you can bend it. But once it cools, it is harder than it was before. He wanted a trophy wife, I said, turning back to Sarah. He's about to find out he married a steel trap. Sarah smiled a sharp, predatory grin. Let's go to mediation. The mediation took place 3 days later in a conference room that smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. The holiday decorations were gone, replaced by the grim gray light of a January morning. Adam sat across from me, flanked by Richard and a lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. They weren't laughing anymore. The arrogance that had filled the dining room at the Obsidian Lodge was gone, replaced by a twitchy, frantic energy. They were cornered animals, and they knew it. But they still had teeth, or so they thought. We are arguing that Miss Kincaid acted in bad faith. Adam's lawyer began shuffling papers with trembling hands. She knowingly concealed significant assets during the marriage. Therefore, we believe the prenuptial agreement is void. Hargrove is entitled to an equitable share of the marital estate, including the King holdings. I sat silently next to Sarah. I didn't need to speak. I just watched them try to rewrite history one last time. Sarah adjusted her glasses. It was a shark's movement. That is an interesting theory, she said calmly. However, the Kincaid Trust is an irrevocable generation-skipping instrument established 5 years before the marriage. It is not marital property. Adam is entitled to 0% of it. Richard slammed his fist on the table. This is entrapment. She sat at our table, listened to us worry about money, and said nothing. She deceived us. Deceived, I spoke for the first time. My voice was low, but it stopped Richard mid-sentence. You never asked Richard, you assumed. You looked at my hands, saw work calluses, and assumed I was poor. You looked at my clothes and assumed I was desperate. That isn't deception. That is your own prejudice blinding you. We want the house, Adam blurted out, his eyes bloodshot. The house is in both our names. I want my share of the equity and I want alimony. I have become accustomed to a certain lifestyle that relied on her support. It was pathetic. The man who had mocked me for being a wood girl was now claiming he needed my money to survive. Sarah pulled a file from her briefcase. Actually, Adam, we are glad you brought up the house and the lifestyle. She slid a document across the table. It was the audit report regarding the $4.8 million loan guarantee Adam had signed. According to the transparency clause in your postnuptial agreement, the one Rachel insisted on years ago, you were required to disclose all debts and liabilities under penalty of perjury. Sarah said you failed to do so. You hid a massive liability attached to a failing crypto venture. And you forged Rachel's signature on a refinancing application to cover your margin calls. The color drained from Adam's face. He looked at the document as if it were a death warrant. Because you violated the transparency clause, Sarah continued, her voice cutting like a knife, the penalty is severe. The court is not going to divide this debt. It is entirely yours. Rachel is absolved of any responsibility for the loan. Furthermore, because you attempted to defraud her regarding the house, we are filing a motion to remove your name from the deed immediately. You leave with what you brought in, Adam, which as of this morning is a massive amount of debt and a potential criminal indictment for forgery. The room went silent. The weight of the moment crushed down on them. The trap they had set for me had snapped shut on their own legs. Richard stood up, his face purple. He leaned over the table, trying one last time to use his physical presence to intimidate me. You listen to me, he growled. You think you can destroy this family? I have friends in this town. I have judges who owe me favors. I will bury you in litigation for the next 10 years. I looked at him. I remembered the way he had laughed on Christmas Eve. I remembered the way he had toasted to my homelessness. Sit down, Richard, I said. I didn't shout. The authority in my voice was absolute. You have no friends, you have accomplices. And accomplices turn on each other when the ship starts to sink. As for burying me, I have the resources to fight you until the next century, but I don't think you will last that long. The auditors are coming for your company on Monday. I suggest you save your energy for them. Richard slumped back into his chair, defeated. I stood up and gathered my coat. Violet, Rachel. Adam whispered. He reached out a hand, tears streaming down his face. Please don't do this. I made a mistake. I was scared. Dad pressured me. I still love you. We can start over. With your capital and my connections, we could be a power couple. Please don't leave me with this debt. I looked at my husband one last time. I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't grieving the loss of his wife. He was grieving the loss of his safety net. You don't love me, Adam, I said. And you certainly don't respect me. I leaned in close so he could hear every syllable. You didn't ask for a divorce because you fell out of love. You asked for a divorce because you thought I was worthless. You tried to throw me away like a broken chair. You only want me now because you realized I am made of gold, but it is too late. Rachel, please, he sobbed. Goodbye, Adam, I said. Try not to spend it all in one place. I walked out of the conference room. I could hear him crying behind me, a jagged, broken sound. 2 police officers were waiting in the hallway to serve the warrant for forgery. I nodded to them as I passed. I walked out of the conference room and down the long hallway of the courthouse. I could hear Adam crying behind me, a jagged, broken sound that echoed off the marble floors. 2 police officers were waiting near the exit to serve the warrant for forgery. I nodded to them as I passed, pushing open the heavy double doors and stepping out into the crisp January air. The sun was shining. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. I wasn't Rachel Hargrove anymore. I wasn't the welder they hid in the corner. I was Rachel Kincaid. I had stripped away the rot, sanded down the rough edges, and revealed the strong, unyielding grain underneath. 6 months later, the snow has melted from the peaks of the Obsidian Lodge, revealing the granite beneath. The resort is under new management mine. We had our best quarter in a decade. I fired the board members who had enabled Richard's spending habits and replaced them with people who understand that value isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. As for the Hargroves, gravity finally took hold. Richard and Susan filed for bankruptcy last month. The country club memberships are gone. The leased jewelry was repossessed. They have been quietly exiled from the social circles they warped, proving that their friends didn't like them. They just liked their money. Adam is currently awaiting trial. He calls me sometimes from a prepaid phone, but I never answer. I blocked the number the day I walked out of mediation. I spend my days in my studio now. I'm working on a new series of sculptures. Large, imposing structures made of reclaimed iron and volcanic glass. I don't hide my hands anymore. I don't cover the scars. But true power isn't just about destroying your enemies. That's just demolition. True power is construction. That is why I launched the Iron and Grit Foundation this morning. It is a $50 million grant program designed specifically for artists, tradespeople, and laborers who have been marginalized by elitist gatekeepers. I am using the Kincaid fortune to fund the people the Haros of the world look down on. This is the justice of the sewer. I realize that revenge is a finite resource. It burns hot and fast like magnesium, but building a legacy that lasts forever. I am not just holding the door open for people like me. I am welding it open so it can never be shut again. Adam and his parents thought I was dirt. They treated me like something to be wiped off their shoes. They forgot that dirt is the only thing that matters. Dirt is where you bury the bodies of the past, and dirt is where you plant the seeds of the future. I am done burying. It is time to grow. If you believe that character is worth more than a bank account, hit that like button and share this story. Let's remind the world that you should never judge a book or a welder by their cover.